They say the Pope sits upon the throne of St. Peter, but the foundation beneath that throne is far older, far darker, and far more complicated than most would dare to imagine. It is not only a seat of holiness, but one of shadows, forged not merely by divine will, but by centuries of blood, ambition, betrayal, and belief. Beneath every white-robed pontiff, beneath every blessing uttered from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, lie the silent echoes of power struggles, secret deals, quiet cover-ups, and lives lost in the pursuit of control. This is not the story told in Sunday sermons. It is the story beneath it, the one whispered in hidden archives and guarded vaults, the story etched in the margins of official history and buried in forgotten tombs. For 2,000 years, the papacy has reigned as one of the most enduring institutions in human civilization. It has shaped kingdoms and crushed rebellions. It has anointed emperors and outlived them. It has declared wars in the name of peace. And yet, behind the pageantry and ritual, there is a deeper truth. The history of the popes is not just the history of holy men. It is the history of politics cloaked in prayer. It is the history of secrets, carefully kept, and sometimes violently preserved. The Pope is often called the Vicar of Christ, the representative of the divine on earth. But he is also the inheritor of an ancient office, one built not just on spiritual authority, but on survival. From the moment St. Peter was executed in Rome, nailed to a cross upside down, the Bishop of Rome became a target, a symbol, and eventually a prize. In the beginning, the papacy was hunted. Its leaders martyred under Roman law, buried in catacombs, names carved in secrecy. But once Rome fell and the empire fractured, the Bishop of Rome didn't fade. He rose. Into the chaos stepped popes like Leo the Great, Gregory the Great, men who turned robes into armor, who negotiated with warlords and wielded scripture like a weapon. Over the centuries, the papacy became more than a spiritual center. It became a power in its own right. It raised armies, it built alliances, it brokered marriages between royal houses and dictated terms to emperors. And in that rise, the shadows grew longer. There were popes who ruled like kings, and kings who begged for forgiveness at the pope's feet. There were councils and conclaves where votes were bought, papal seats traded like coin, and oaths whispered in candlelit chambers. There were crusades waged in the name of salvation, and inquisitions launched to extinguish dissent. There were scandals, of money, of blood, of flesh, some forgotten, others deliberately erased. And through it all, the Church endured. Tonight, we begin a journey through that endurance, a slow walk through 20 centuries of light and shadow, of saints and schemers, of sacred vows and secret sins. We will walk through corridors of gold and blood. We will meet men who believed they were chosen by God, and men who used God to justify their ambitions. We will open sealed doors. We will listen closely to the silence between the facts. This is not a story of judgment. It is a story of complexity, of how the divine and the human have always been entangled, how power and faith, love and fear, holiness and corruption have danced together in the halls of the Vatican for nearly 2,000 years. This is the dark history of the popes. This story will explore various ages of this glim and dark history. Bear with me, it will be divided into different sections to reflect this events and ages. And the story begins now. It begins not in cathedrals or councils, but in shadows, beneath the ground, behind locked doors, in hushed prayers whispered by torchlight. The earliest bishops of Rome did not rule, nor did they sit upon thrones. They hid, they ran, they died. When St. Peter was crucified upside down by his own request, it was not in a time of glory but of terror. Nero's Rome had become a furnace for the followers of Christ. Blamed for a fire they didn't start, Christians were rounded up like criminals. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were dipped in pitch and burned alive to light the emperor's gardens at night. It was in this world, violent, unstable, cruel, that the lineage of the popes began. Peter's death was only the first in a long line of martyrdoms. Bishop after bishop would meet a similar fate. Pope Clement I was exiled by Emperor Trajan and, according to tradition, tied to an anchor and drowned in the Black Sea. Pope Sixtus II was executed during Mass in 258 AD, cut down with 4 of his deacons in the catacombs of San Callisto. Fabian, known for dividing the church into 7 districts and appointing deacons over each, was arrested during the Decian persecutions and beheaded. These were not men of power. They were marked men, leaders of a fragile, hunted flock. Yet somehow, they endured. They worshipped in secret, in underground cemeteries beneath Rome known as catacombs. These dark tunnels were more than burial places. They were sanctuaries, carved with symbols and prayers, echoing with songs of hope and sorrow. Here, the bishops of Rome celebrated the Eucharist on makeshift altars. Here they preached forgiveness while the empire prepared their executions. Each death did not end the line. Instead, another would quietly take the mantle, sometimes lasting only months before meeting the same fate. The continuity is astonishing. While emperors came and went, while Rome itself burned and rebuilt, the line of bishops persisted, underground, in silence, in faith. But the danger came not only from outside. As Christianity spread across the empire, it began to fracture. Debates erupted. Was Christ fully divine, fully human, or both? What did it mean to be baptized? What books were truly scripture? These theological disputes weren't abstract, they were dangerous. Take, for instance, the Novatian Schism in the 3rd century. After the Decian persecution, many Christians who had renounced their faith to survive wanted to return. Pope Cornelius welcomed them back. But Novatian, a rigorous priest, declared the church must remain pure and broke away, claiming the true faith for himself. The division nearly tore the church apart. Others, like the Montanists and Gnostics, pushed alternative visions of the faith, some mystical, some elitist, some apocalyptic. Each heresy forced the bishops of Rome to define doctrine more clearly, to draw lines to protect orthodoxy. And each conflict further revealed the tension at the heart of the early church, how to remain unified under pressure, both external and internal. Rome, meanwhile, continued its crackdown. Emperors like Decius, Valerian, and Diocletian launched periodic persecutions. Christians were ordered to sacrifice to the Roman gods or die, and many did die. Thousands upon thousands, including church leaders, deacons, lay people, entire families. The bishops of Rome were often high on the list. The church's persistence was seen as defiance. But something strange began to happen in the midst of this cruelty. As the blood of martyrs flowed, the church grew stronger. Stories of courage spread from city to city. Converts came not in spite of the danger, but because of it. They were moved by the calm strength of those who faced lions and swords with serenity. The martyrs were not just victims, they became symbols. And their legacy began to shape the identity of the church itself. By the early 4th century, with the empire struggling under civil wars and unrest, even Rome could not sustain its war on faith forever. And in 313 AD, an unexpected shift occurred. The Edict of Milan, issued by Emperor Constantine and co-emperor Licinius, it legalized Christianity across the empire. In a single proclamation, 3 centuries of persecution came to an end. For the Bishop of Rome, by then an aging man named Miltiades, it was a moment of quiet triumph. He emerged from the shadows not as a rebel, but as a leader of a now legitimate faith. No longer would Christian ceremonies be held by candlelight beneath the earth. The church could now breathe in the open air. But this new freedom came with a paradox. The persecution had refined the church, burned away ambition, and united believers in suffering. Now the church would face a new temptation: power. Constantine's patronage would soon bring influence, wealth, and political entanglements. The line of popes would continue, but the world they inherited would never again be the same. And so the first age of the papacy closes not with a coronation, but with a question. How did this fragile chain of fugitives, hunted and reviled, survive nearly 3 centuries of suppression? Was it divine protection, or a perfect blend of secrecy, courage, and quiet defiance? The truth may lie somewhere in between. The early papacy was not yet mighty, but it was unbreakable. And in that resilience, the seeds of future power were already planted. Constantine and the rise of a political papacy. When the night finally broke, it did so not with a whisper, but with a decree. In the year 313 CE, Emperor Constantine the Great, alongside his eastern co-emperor Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan, a document that, for the first time in Roman history, declared Christianity to be a religio licita, a lawful religion. The centuries of fear, flight, and bloodshed that had defined the early papacy were suddenly, officially, over. Yet the end of persecution was not the end of danger. It was the beginning of a different kind of trial, for in that moment, the papacy stepped out of the catacombs and into the palace. The story of Constantine's conversion is as iconic as it is mysterious. On the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, he is said to have seen a vision in the sky, a cross of light accompanied by the words in hoc signo vinces, "In this sign, you will conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields, and they emerged victorious. Whether miracle, myth, or calculated political move, the effect was seismic. Constantine quickly positioned himself as a patron of the Christian Church, showering it with privileges, lands, and prestige. In 324, after defeating Licinius and becoming sole emperor, he summoned the first truly ecumenical council in Christian history, the First Council of Nicaea, in 325 CE. The stakes were theological, but the method was imperial. At Nicaea, bishops debated the nature of Christ. Was he created or co-eternal with the Father? The council ultimately rejected the teachings of Arius, who claimed Christ was a created being, and adopted the Nicene Creed, affirming the consubstantiality of the Son and the Father. But something deeper was unfolding. Christianity was becoming statecraft. Rome's bishop did not preside over Nicaea. That honor fell to Hosius of Corduba, Constantine's trusted advisor. But the Bishop of Rome was now being pulled into the gravitational field of empire. The age of martyrdom was giving way to something new, the age of influence. By the mid-4th century, the Bishop of Rome was no longer merely one of many regional leaders. He was beginning to assert primacy, not simply over the West, but over the entire Christian world. The roots of this claim lay in tradition. Rome was the city of Peter and Paul, the two great martyrs of the faith. By spiritual inheritance, the bishop of this city was seen to hold a special authority. In 366 CE, the papacy experienced one of its first internal crises. Following the death of Pope Liberius, two rival factions elected different successors, Damasus I and Ursinus. The streets of Rome erupted into violence. In a bitter, bloody struggle, Damasus eventually prevailed, but only after armed conflict left scores of dead inside churches themselves. Damasus, who reigned until 384, seized the moment. He emphasized the apostolic foundation of his office and styled himself as the legitimate heir to Peter. He commissioned the great biblical scholar Jerome to translate the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate, anchoring the church's teachings in a language now favored by the imperial court. It was during Damasus's time that the title Pontifex Maximus, once borne by Roman emperors, began to shift toward the papacy, though officially the emperors retained it until Gratian renounced it in 376. As Rome's bishops began to rise in stature, tensions with the Eastern churches deepened. In cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and especially Constantinople, the new capital founded by Constantine in 330 CE, bishops began claiming increasing authority. The rivalry between East and West was not only theological, but cultural and political. The Council of Constantinople in 381 elevated the Bishop of Constantinople to a place of honor second only to Rome, igniting disputes that would simmer for centuries. Still, Rome maintained a unique prestige. Unlike the Eastern bishops, the Pope in Rome was physically distant from the imperial court. He could cultivate the image of independence, a spiritual voice unsullied by palace intrigues. And sometimes, that image was powerful enough to stop even an empire. In the year 452 CE, the Western Roman Empire was dying. Its territories were falling to barbarian incursions. That summer, Attila the Hun, the feared scourge of God, crossed the Alps and descended into Italy. Cities burned, panic spread. The imperial court was paralyzed. And so it was Pope Leo I, known to history as Leo the Great, who rode out to meet Attila, not as a general, but as a pontiff. What was said between them remains a mystery. Ancient sources, like Prosper of Aquitaine, suggest Leo persuaded Attila to turn back, perhaps through diplomacy, perhaps through bribes, perhaps with the divine weight of his authority. Whatever the truth, Attila did withdraw, and the legend was born that a pope, unarmed and in white, had faced down the terror of the age and prevailed. Leo reigned from 440 to 461 CE, and in that time, he reshaped the vision of the papacy. In his famous tome of Leo, he declared that Christ had two natures, fully divine and fully human, a doctrine later affirmed at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. But Leo went further. He argued that the Pope was the spiritual heir of Peter, with a divine mandate to guide not only Rome but the entire Church. It was bold, It was political, and it was effective. The transformation of the papacy in this era was not an explosion, but a quiet unfolding. It did not seize power overnight. It absorbed it, step by step, edict by edict. Popes learned to navigate imperial favor, to shape doctrine at councils, to balance between theological conviction and political necessity. Their letters, papal decretals, began to carry the weight of law. Their voice, once silenced in persecution, was now amplified through imperial scribes and global councils. And yet, this new power brought its own dangers. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE with the deposition of the boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus left a void. Kings rose from the wreckage. Goths, Lombards, Franks. But amid the chaos, the Pope remained, no longer simply a bishop, but now the de facto guardian of Roman memory and moral authority. The shift was subtle, dressed in prayer but laced with ambition. This was no longer just a church of saints and martyrs. It was becoming a court, a power, a throne. By the end of the 6th century, the world the early popes had known was gone. The empire had fractured. The old cities lay in ruin, and the church, once buried in catacombs, now stood above ground, with bishops in silk and the Bishop of Rome recognized as a central force in European affairs. But the transformation was not yet complete. Ahead lay greater ambition, greater darkness, and a man named Gregory, a monk turned master, who would take the papacy further than ever before. The martyr's fire had dimmed, the monarch's torch had been lit, and the shadows, once so distant, began to flicker again, not from the threat of lions, but from the light of crowns. The making of a kingmaker, Gregory the Great and the mission to rule souls. In the cold, crumbling corridors of post-imperial Rome, amid famine, plague, and barbarian raids, a monk withdrew into silence and emerged as a kingmaker. The Western Roman Empire had fallen in 476 CE. Italy, once the heart of an empire, was now a war-torn, disease-ridden land ruled by shifting tribes and forgotten emperors. But in 590 CE, a new pope would rise, not from the old Roman senatorial class, but from the cloister. His name was Gregory, son of a noble patrician family and once prefect of Rome. He would become Gregory I, remembered forever as Gregory the Great. Gregory had turned from worldly power early in life. After his father's death, he converted the family villa on Rome's Celian Hill into a monastery dedicated to St. Andrew and lived as a Benedictine monk. But Rome needed leadership. In 579 CE, Pope Pelagius II sent him to Constantinople as an apocrisiarius, a papal ambassador to the Byzantine court. It was here Gregory saw firsthand the fragile relations between the Eastern and Western churches, and how far imperial protection had waned. When Pelagius died of plague in 590, the Roman people clamored for Gregory to lead. He resisted, even tried to flee, but was consecrated pope on September 3, 590 CE. From the moment he took office, Gregory governed not as a prince, but as a spiritual tactician. Rome, battered by famine and the Lombard invasions, which had begun in 568 CE, was leaderless and desperate. Gregory acted swiftly. He organized food distribution, restructured the church's land management to fund charity, and negotiated directly with Lombard warlords to spare cities from destruction. In effect, he assumed the role once held by imperial governors, not with legions, but with letters and monks. It was, quietly, a revolution. In 596 CE, Gregory launched one of the most far-reaching papal initiatives in early medieval history, the Gregorian Mission. He dispatched a band of 40 monks, led by Augustine of Canterbury, to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. At the time, England was a patchwork of pagan kingdoms, with scattered remnants of earlier Roman Christianity long extinguished. Augustine landed in Kent in 597 CE, where he successfully converted King Ethelbert. This laid the foundation for what would become the English Church, firmly loyal to Rome. It was not just a spiritual triumph. It was a strategic one. By extending papal influence to the fringes of Europe, Gregory began to build a transnational network of bishops who owed their faith and their allegiance to the Bishop of Rome. His letters show an obsession not with pomp, but with discipline, orthodoxy, and moral order. And through it all, he cultivated a language of humility, calling himself Servus Servorum Dei, the servant of the servants of God. It was a calculated title, soft hands, firm control. But Gregory's genius extended beyond diplomacy. He was also a theological innovator. and not always in line with earlier doctrine. He developed a more systematized view of purgatory, a place of temporary purification after death where the soul could be aided by prayers and masses. In Dialogues, Book 4, c. 593 CE, he vividly described souls being freed from suffering through the intercession of the Church. This idea, that the Church could intervene in the fate of souls, gave the papacy immense spiritual leverage. Over time, it would lay the groundwork for indulgences, prayers for the dead, and a transactional economy of salvation that would come to dominate medieval piety. Gregory also promoted penance as both a sacrament and a system of spiritual discipline, empowering the Church to assign and oversee moral restitution. The confessional became not just a place of forgiveness, but a seat of control. Gregory's reforms extended to worship itself. Though later legends overstated his role in codifying the Gregorian chant, he did standardize and simplify liturgical practices across the Western Church. By emphasizing uniformity in ritual, theology, and prayer, Gregory was centralizing the Catholic experience. Wherever one went, the voice of Rome would echo the same. He also reorganized the Church's administrative structure, strengthening the role of papal legates, empowering bishops, and curbing clerical abuses. This bureaucratic rigor would help the papacy outlive kings, emperors, and dynasties. Gregory died on March 12, 604 CE, after 14 years of papal rule. He was buried at St. Peter's Basilica, beneath an inscription that honored his balance of contemplation and action. But Gregory's impact would stretch far beyond his tomb. He had built a new model for the papacy. Neither a martyr nor a monarch, but something in between. A spiritual sovereign, cloaked in humility, yet commanding nations. Within a century, the papacy would fully inherit the remnants of Western imperial authority, and Gregory's reforms would make that possible. In the 8th century, the echoes of Gregory Thyrsus' consolidation would take on new life. During the reign of Pope Gregory II, 715 to 731 CE, the papacy entered open conflict with the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, who issued the Iconoclast Edict in 726 CE, banning the veneration of religious images. Gregory VI defied the edict. Rome rioted. The Pope began asserting independence from Constantinople, laying the groundwork for the papacy's eventual alliance with the Frankish kings. Though a century had passed since Gregory the Great, his vision of a spiritually assertive and politically independent papacy was now bearing fruit. In 739 CE, Pope Gregory III, successor to Gregory II, appealed to the Frankish leader Charles Martel, grandfather of Charlemagne, for military aid against the Lombards. Though Martel declined, the plea marked a turning point. The Pope was now looking west, not east, for protection. A new alliance was forming. The papacy had begun its slow pivot from being a spiritual voice under imperial shadow to becoming a sovereign actor among kings. And in the coming century, that alliance would be sealed with a crown. In just over 100 years, the papacy had transformed. From Gregory I's ascension in 590 CE to Gregory III's appeal in 739 CE, Rome had rebuilt its moral authority, extended its reach to the edges of Europe, and laid the intellectual and spiritual foundations for centuries of power. It had developed doctrine, ordered penance, tamed chaos, and dared to defy emperors. Not with armies, but with ink, monks, and unyielding resolve. No longer just the heir of Peter. Now the Pope was becoming heir to an empire. The next step? A forged document, a king crowned by papal hands, and the beginning of Christendom as a political machine. But that would require a lie. Dark Ages, darker popes. The pornocracy and the House of Theodora. As the light of the ancient world dimmed and the centuries drifted into what historians would later call the Dark Ages, the city of Rome stood as a crumbling shadow of its imperial past. The Colosseum was no longer a theater of spectacle, but a ruin overgrown with ivy and silence. The marble of empire had cracked. Yet amidst the fading grandeur, the Bishop of Rome, successor to Peter, remained, cloaked in white, carrying the hopes of Christendom through turbulent waters. But the purity of that cloak, in these centuries, was stained. In the late 9th century, after a string of short and often violent papacies, the Holy Office descended into one of its darkest eras. The pontificate was no longer guarded by saints or scholars, but hijacked by Roman nobility, particularly by women whose names history once dared not speak aloud. From the palaces on the Palatine Hill to the chambers of the Lateran, the Church was no longer guided by the Spirit, but ensnared by the ambitions of Theodora and her daughter, Marozia, matriarchs of the powerful Theophylact family. This was the age some would come to call the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Century. And in the words of later chroniclers, it was the rule of the harlots. The horror of it first crystallized in the winter of 897. Pope Formosus had died the year before, his body laid to rest within the hallowed confines of St. Peter's Basilica. Yet Rome was not done with him. In a grotesque spectacle that chills the soul even now, his decomposing corpse was exhumed, dressed again in papal robes and seated on a throne to stand trial. Pope Stephen VI, one of his rivals, presided over the court. Before bishops and nobles, a deacon was appointed to speak on behalf of the corpse. The charges were absurd, violations of canon law, but the outcome was already known. Formosus was found guilty, stripped, mutilated, and cast into the Tiber River. Such was the chaos of the papacy in these years. No longer a beacon of unity, it had become a pawn in the rivalries of Roman aristocrats. From 896 to 904, 9 popes rose and fell in rapid succession, some reigning for mere weeks, others murdered, others imprisoned or exiled. The throne of Peter had become a seat of peril, each occupant more vulnerable than the last. And then came Sergius III. In the year 904, Sergius claimed the papal seat with the backing of the Theophylacts. He brought stability, but at a cost. It is widely believed that he began an affair with the young Marozia, daughter of Theodora. From this union, whether through affection or calculation, was born a son. His name was Octavianus, and one day he would wear the tiara. Marozia wielded power with the quiet authority of a queen. Though she never held official office, she ruled Rome through her lovers, husbands, and sons. When Sergius died in 911, she maneuvered the election of compliant successors, removing rivals with bribes, blackmail, or blood. By 931, her son Octavian, just 21 years old, was enthroned as Pope John Fluthin, the first pontiff born from a papal affair. Marozia's influence did not end there. She married into the Alberic family, another Roman dynasty, tightening her grip on the city. But eventually, even she would fall. Her own son from another marriage, Alberic II, grew jealous of her control. In 932, he led a revolt, imprisoned his mother, and installed his half-brother John V as a puppet pope under his supervision. The mistress of Rome, who had placed popes like chess pieces on the board, vanished into a prison cell. Her fate, like the truth of her power, faded into silence. But the legacy she left behind continued. In 955, another son of the aristocracy, Octavianus, the great-grandson of Theodora and likely the grandson of Sergius III, was elevated to the papacy. He took the name John VII, and with him, the office fell to one of its lowest ebbs. Barely 18, John was crowned vicar of Christ, but he reigned more like a Roman prince than a shepherd of souls. His Lateran palace became infamous, not for prayer, but for parties. Chronicles of the time speak in hushed tones of orgies, bribes, and acts so profane they seemed torn from the pages of pagan myth. He was said to gamble with the treasures of the church, toast to Jupiter rather than Christ, and even commit rape within the sacred halls of the basilica. When Emperor Otto I came to Rome in 962 to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, tensions flared. The imperial court, dismayed by John's open depravity, demanded reform. John responded not with penance, but with rebellion. He plotted against the emperor, fled Rome, and excommunicated Otto from exile. In return, Otto summoned a synod, declared John deposed, and installed a new pope. But fate had already sealed John's end. In May of 964, in a room heavy with incense and secrets, John the Falcon reportedly died of a stroke. He had been caught in bed with another man's wife. Some say the husband murdered him in rage. Others say his body simply failed under the weight of years lived too fast. Either way, the boy pope was gone, and with him, a chapter of disgrace. And yet through it all, the papal line remained unbroken. There is something haunting about the resilience of the papacy during this time. Even as Rome collapsed into corruption, even as blood soaked the marble floors of the Lateran, the church endured. It did not shatter, it did not burn. It whispered forward, century by century, as if on some deeper current. One wonders how the faithful of distant lands understood these events. In the monasteries of Gaul, in the snow-covered chapels of the Germanic kingdoms, priests and monks still lit candles, chanted psalms, and celebrated the Mass. Perhaps they had not heard the full truth, or perhaps they believed not in the men who wore the robe, but in the grace behind the office. There was, after all, something eternal in the idea of Peter's keys, something that even scandal could not smother. Like a flame buried beneath ash, the soul of the church smoldered quietly. Waiting. As the 10th century came to a close and the millennium loomed on the horizon, the papacy stood battered, yet breathing. The Roman aristocracy would soon lose its grip. Reformers stirred in the shadows, and new kings looked to the church not as a lover, but as a rival. Theodora and Marozia passed into legend, half whispered, half cursed. But their influence lingered like perfume in a ruined hall. Now a new struggle awaited, no longer between families, but between thrones. Kings would bend their knees before popes, emperors would be cast down by blessings turned to curses. The church would claw back power, not with seduction, but with excommunication. A war for the soul of the world was coming, and it would begin with a barefoot monarch walking through the snow. Bookmark: Power versus Faith, the medieval clashes and the war for souls. The morning frost still clung to the stone of Canosa's castle walls as the emperor arrived, barefoot and cloaked only in penitence. It was January 1077, and the alpine wind cut through flesh and pride alike. For 3 days, Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, stood outside in the snow, seeking absolution not from God directly, but from the man who now dared to stand above emperors, Pope Gregory VII. The moment was quiet, yet history rang loudly. This was no longer the fragile Church of Martyrs or the decadent court of Roman aristocrats. By the 11th century, the papacy had risen from the ashes of its darkest age and wrapped itself in something formidable: moral authority. But power, once reclaimed, does not remain passive, and so began a new chapter, no longer defined by scandal, but by struggle. The seeds had been sown decades earlier as reformers in monastic strongholds like Cluny began to challenge the corruption and secular control of church offices. The papacy, long entangled with kings and nobles, began to strain against their grip. At the heart of the conflict stood a question centuries in the making. Who held the right to invest bishops with the ring and staff of office? Kings believed it was their divine right. Popes now claimed otherwise. In 1075, Pope Gregory II, born Hildebrand of Savona, issued the Dictatus Papae, a radical declaration of papal supremacy. It claimed the Pope alone could depose emperors, and that his authority was absolute over all Christendom. For Henry IV, newly crowned and still consolidating his power in the Germanic lands, it was intolerable. What followed was the investiture controversy, a confrontation that would last over 50 years and define the political theology of the Middle Ages. Henry responded by deposing Gregory. Gregory replied by excommunicating Henry twice. Each excommunication undermined Henry's legitimacy. His nobles rebelled, his throne teetered. Thus the humbled walk to Canossa, but Gregory's triumph was short-lived. After a temporary reconciliation, Henry rallied, marched on Rome in 1084, and installed an antipope, Clement III. Gregory fled and died in exile the following year. Though beaten, his vision endured. His successors would fight on. By the early 12th century, the papacy had grown into something new, a monarchy in its own right, draped not in armor but in sanctity. Popes no longer merely survived, they ruled. The resolution of the investiture controversy came in 1122 with the Concordat of Worms under Pope Calixtus II and Emperor Henry V. A compromise was reached. The emperor would retain influence over secular investiture, but spiritual authority now belonged solely to the church. And with that, the pope became more than a pastor. He became a king of kings. Nowhere was this new vision of the papacy more fully realized than in the reign of Pope Innocent III. Ascending the throne in 1198, Innocent, barely 37 years old, ruled with serene confidence and strategic brilliance. He declared the Pope lower than God but higher than man, and acted accordingly. He intervened in imperial elections, annulled royal marriages, and placed entire kingdoms under interdict when rulers disobeyed. Even King John of England, in defiance of Rome, was forced to submit and offer his crown to Innocent as a vassal in 1213. But Innocent's vision extended far beyond diplomacy. He called for the Fourth Crusade in 1202. Yet the warriors of Christ did not reach the Holy Land. Instead, driven by Venetian politics and greed, they sacked the Christian city of Constantinople in 1204, one of the greatest betrayals in church history. Though Innocent condemned the act, it served his purpose. The Eastern Orthodox Church, long estranged, was weakened, and Rome's supremacy felt ever more inevitable. Closer to home, another conflict raged, one darker and cloaked in theological purity. In southern France, a sect known as the Cathars had taken root, preaching a dualistic vision that condemned the material world as evil. To Rome, it was heresy. After the murder of a papal legate, Innocent declared a crusade, not against Muslims or pagans, but against fellow Christians. The Albigensian Crusade would last for 2 decades. Entire towns were massacred. At Béziers in 1209, when crusaders asked how to distinguish heretic from faithful, the papal legate reportedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Over 20,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered. The south of France was devastated. The Cathars were extinguished, and the precedent was set. The sword could be turned inward. It was in this climate that the Church created its most feared instrument, the Inquisition. Originally established in 1231 by Pope Gregory X, the Inquisition was designed to root out heresy with methodical efficiency. It was secretive, relentless, and protected by the full weight of papal authority. Trials were often conducted without the accused knowing their accuser. Torture was sanctioned to extract confession, and once condemned, heretics faced the stake, their ashes left to the wind. In these centuries, the line between spiritual care and domination blurred. The Church, once a refuge, had become a tribunal. Faith was policed, books were banned, thought itself fell under scrutiny. And yet, for many, it was also a time of deep devotion. Cathedrals soared into the skies, pilgrimages stretched across Europe. Orders like the Franciscans emerged, calling for poverty and humility, echoing Christ in a world of gold. There was beauty, yes, but always shadow. By the mid-13th century, the papacy sat at the summit of earthly influence. It had triumphed over emperors, crusaded against kings, and dictated the fate of entire nations. But there was a cost. The papacy had become the throne it once stood apart from. The humble sandals of Peter had been traded for jeweled slippers. The shepherd's staff was now a scepter. And still, far on the horizon, storm clouds gathered. For even as popes crowned emperors and ruled from gilded palaces, a sickness was growing in the foundations. The people were beginning to whisper. The corruption of power, once justified by piety, would soon face revolt. But first, the popes would be driven from Rome, and the Church would fracture in 3. Avignon, schism, and scandal. The papacy in exile. The bells of Rome rang less brightly in the early 1300s. The Eternal City, once the heartbeat of an empire and the sacred seat of Peter's successors, was beginning to decay under the weight of its own history. Streets once paved for triumph, now echoed with the footsteps of ghosts. The papacy, so long the city's soul, was preparing to abandon it. In 1305, after a divisive conclave of 11 months, the cardinals elected a Frenchman as pope, Bertrand de Got, who took the name Clement I. But rather than journey to Rome to claim the throne of Peter, Clement set his eyes on safer ground. The city of Avignon, nestled on the banks of the Rhone River in what was then the Holy Roman Empire but under strong French influence, became his sanctuary. In 1309, Pope Clement V formally moved the papal court to Avignon. Rome was left behind. What began as a temporary relocation stretched into 7 decades. From 1309 to 1377, 7 consecutive popes, all French, ruled not from the Vatican, but from the walled palaces of Avignon. The papacy, in spirit and in practice, had become entangled in the orbit of the French crown. The Church framed the move as pragmatic. Rome, after centuries of neglect, was plagued by lawlessness, factional violence, and crumbling infrastructure. But many saw through the justification. Avignon was comfortable, lavish, and protected. Yet it was also compromised. This period came to be known by critics then and historians later as the Babylonian captivity of the Church, invoking the ancient Jewish exile to Babylon. For 70 years, the Bishop of Rome no longer sat in Rome. He sat in a gilded prison of convenience and foreign control. The consequences were profound. Avignon's papacy grew rich, indulgent, and notoriously corrupt. The papal court, surrounded by vineyards and guarded by French troops, came to resemble a royal palace more than a spiritual sanctuary. Heavy taxes were imposed across Christendom to fund the growing bureaucracy, and simony, the sale of church offices, became systemic. The moral rot was visible, even as the buildings gleamed. Poets like Petrarch, who witnessed the court's splendor, described it as a fountain of sorrow, a sewer of vice, the refuge of wrath. Beneath the polite diplomacy of the popes, alliances were forged, bribes exchanged, and the ideals of apostolic poverty quietly drowned in barrels of wine. Back in Rome, the people grew restless. Pilgrims still came, clinging to the sacred stones of martyrdom, but they found no pope to bless them. No cross was raised from the Vatican Hill. Just silence and growing shame. But the exile would not last forever. In 1377, after pressure from reformers, mystics like Catherine of Siena, and an unstable political climate, Pope Gregory XI made the momentous decision to return to Rome. After 68 years, the papacy was home again. The people rejoiced, and for a moment, the soul of the church seemed to breathe freely. That breath did not last long. When Gregory XI died in March 1378, the Roman people demanded a pope of their own, an Italian. In fear of riots, the cardinals hastily elected Urban VI, an Italian archbishop known for his austerity and reformist zeal. But once enthroned, Urban's temperament turned volatile. He alienated many cardinals with his harsh reforms, rage-fueled outbursts, and accusations of corruption. Just months later, a group of cardinals claimed the election had been made under duress and declared it invalid. They fled to Anagni and elected a rival pope, Clement VI, a Frenchman, who re-established the court in Avignon. The result was chaos. Two men claimed to be the rightful pope, one in Rome, one in Avignon. Each excommunicated the other. Each appointed his own cardinals, bishops, and emissaries. Kings and kingdoms took sides. France, Scotland, and parts of Spain supported the Avignon line. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy backed the Roman claimant. This was the beginning of the Western Schism, a fracture that would last from 1378 to 1417. For nearly 40 years, Christendom was divided, not by faith, but by obedience. The spiritual wound cut deep. Ordinary believers, already burdened by plague, famine, and war, now faced an impossible question. Who truly spoke for God? Two men wore the tiara. Two courts claimed the truth. Was the church still one, holy, and apostolic, or had it become a palace of mirrors? Efforts to resolve the crisis began in earnest. In 1409, the Council of Pisa was convened by cardinals from both obediences. There, in an audacious act, they deposed both reigning popes and elected a third, Alexander V. But instead of healing the divide, they deepened it. Now there were three popes, each with their own curia, supporters, and claim to legitimacy. It would take another council, one far more forceful and determined, to restore unity. In 1414, the Council of Constance was called by King Sigismund of the Holy Roman Empire and Pope John XXIII, not to be confused with the 20th century pope of the same name, as the name would later be considered part of the Pisan line and unofficial. Over 4 years, the council deposed or accepted the resignation of all claimants. One by one, they fell. In 1415, the Avignon Pope Benedict XIII was excommunicated. In 1417, a new, universally accepted pope was elected, Martin V. The schism was over, but the scars remained. The faithful had spent nearly 40 years in confusion. Monasteries had split, bishops had been appointed and reappointed. The authority of the papacy, once seen as the anchor of the Christian world, had been exposed as fallible, political, and painfully human. And the wounds went deeper still. Throughout the 14th century, as the papacy played musical thrones, the world was changing. The Black Death ravaged Europe from 1347 to 1351, killing nearly 1/3 of the continent's population. The clergy, who should have offered comfort, often fled. Trust in institutions waned. Rumors of divine punishment mingled with calls for reform. And in the vacuum of moral clarity, new voices began to rise. John Wycliffe in England, Jan Hus in Bohemia. Both preached against the wealth and corruption of the church. Both questioned papal authority. Both would be condemned, Wycliffe posthumously and Hus at the stake in 1415, during the very council meant to restore unity. Faith had not died, but it had been wounded. As the 15th century dawned, the papacy was once more united, but not yet redeemed. Its foundations, cracked by exile and schism, now rested on a shifting world. The age of unquestioned spiritual monarchy was fading. A new age of artists, poisoners, and papal patrons was about to begin. The Renaissance popes, patrons poison and the selling of salvation. By the dawn of the 15th century, the papacy had survived exile and schism, but not without cost. The throne of Peter had been restored, yet the authority it once commanded felt different now, less divine, more political. And into that space of uncertainty, opulence crept. Rome had been a crumbling shadow of itself in the years after the schism. But the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical art, learning, and human ambition, was sweeping across Italy, and with it came a new vision of what the papacy could be. The popes of the 15th and 16th centuries would drape themselves not only in spiritual vestments, but in the garments of kings, generals, and patrons of empire. The throne that once weathered martyrdom would now commission masterpieces, conspire in palaces, and sell eternity by the coin. The change began with Pope Nicholas V, elected in 1447. A scholar and lover of antiquity, he dreamed of a papacy that would embody the grandeur of ancient Rome. He commissioned the rebuilding of the Vatican Library and envisioned a city of marble and glory, a spiritual capital that would dazzle the eye and command the soul. But grandeur came at a price, and his successors would become all too comfortable exacting it. By the time Rodrigo Borgia seized the papal throne in 1492, the gap between holiness and ambition had grown perilously thin. Taking the name Pope Alexander VI, Borgia epitomized the corruption of the Renaissance papacy. A Spanish cardinal with a legacy steeped in nepotism and greed, Alexander openly elevated his children, despite his vows of celibacy. His son, Cesare Borgia, became a military commander and political assassin. His daughter, Lucrezia, moved through Italy's noble courts as a pawn in her father's calculated alliances. The Lateran Palace, once the site of councils and creeds, now echoed with rumors of banquets, bribes, and brothels. Even as Alexander blessed the faithful from balconies, poison flowed through the corridors of power. Political enemies vanished. Gold changed hands. Forgiveness could be purchased. Rome glittered, but something sacred had dimmed. Yet the papacy, for all its scandals, did not lose its sense of divine mission, only its sense of humility. Pope Julius II, elected in 1503, styled himself the warrior pope. Unlike his decadent predecessor, Julius wore armor over vestments and marched with armies to reclaim papal territories. His papacy blurred the line between shepherd and sovereign. Under Julius, the Vatican became not only a spiritual seat, but a fortified citadel. And it was Julius who summoned Michelangelo in 1508 to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the most iconic artistic commission in papal history. Yet even this sacred task was stained with pressure. Michelangelo worked under the constant threat of papal wrath, enduring years of backbreaking labor to create a celestial masterpiece above the place where popes were crowned. Art became propaganda. Faith became theater. Meanwhile, in the cities and villages beyond the Vatican walls, the common faithful bore the weight of contradiction. They paid indulgences, donations meant to reduce punishment in the afterlife for themselves and their departed loved ones. The theology was subtle. Repentance plus penance, offered through the church, could shorten one's time in purgatory. But the practice had become a machine of revenue. By the early 16th century, indulgence campaigns funded vast projects, including St. Peter's Basilica, whose reconstruction began under Pope Julius II and continued under Pope Leo X, a member of the powerful Medici family. The basilica would rise in splendor, built upon coins dropped into boxes by peasants who believed they were buying mercy. The words of the German preacher Johann Tetzel, who raised funds through indulgences on behalf of the Pope, captured the moment in chilling simplicity. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. It was Tetzel's preaching that drew the ire of a young Augustinian monk named Martin Luther. On October 31st, 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. His act was not yet a revolution, but it was a spark. He challenged not only the sale of indulgences, but the very notion of papal supremacy. Rome's response was swift and sharp. Pope Leo X excommunicated Luther in 1521 with the papal bull Exsurge Domine. But the damage had been done. A fracture had opened that no art or army could seal. The Renaissance popes had adorned the church in gold, but the soul of the church was bleeding. Ironically, even as the Reformation ignited, the Vatican reached new artistic heights. Under Pope Clement II, yet another Medici, Rome hosted some of the greatest artistic minds in history. But Clement's political failures would cost the church dearly. In 1527, the imperial troops of Charles V sacked Rome itself. Thousands were killed, churches were looted, and the Pope was imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo. It was a divine humiliation. The capital of Christendom lay in ruins, pillaged by Christian soldiers, and the Pope, heir of Peter, cowered behind stone walls. Faith, art, power, blood, all now blurred together. Even after the sack, the papacy refused to let go of its Renaissance vision. Pope Paul III, elected in 1534, embodied both the worst and best of the era. A political schemer, he appointed two of his teenage grandsons as cardinals. Yet it was Paul who would later summon the Council of Trent, the first serious attempt at institutional reform. The Renaissance popes had brought the church to a tipping point. The Counter-Reformation would answer. But that belonged to the next chapter. For now, the 15th and 16th centuries had revealed the strange paradox of the papal throne, that the guardian of eternal truth could be seduced by temporal beauty, that the vicar of Christ could build heaven with coin and kiss kings while forgetting the cross. Under frescoed ceilings and marble domes, the papacy had bought splendor. But the cost was the trust of millions. The seeds of rebellion had been planted in golden soil. Nate. Reformation, retaliation, the Counter-Reformation, and the iron grip. The year was 1521, and the Pope's parchment crackled like thunder. Exsurge Domine, it read. Arise, O Lord, a wild boar has invaded your vineyard. With these words, Pope Leo X excommunicated Martin Luther, a once obscure monk from Saxony who had dared to question the church's authority, not with violence, but with ink and conscience. Just 4 years earlier, Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the doors of the Castle Church in Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517, a challenge to the corrupt sale of indulgences. But behind the coins and promises, he had struck at something deeper. The papal claim to ultimate spiritual authority. Was the Pope truly the voice of Christ on earth, or had that voice been drowned in the clinking of gold? Luther's words spread with the wind, carried by the printing press, now revolutionizing Europe. By 1520, his pamphlets had reached every corner of the continent. His trial at the Diet of Worms in 1521, where he refused to recant, marked a point of no return. The Church, so long the unchallenged shepherd of Christendom, now faced a fractured flock. The papacy reeled, but it did not collapse. Instead, it prepared to strike back. The decades that followed became a war not only of faith, but of control. Control over belief, over truth, over the very soul of Europe. And the chief weapon of Rome's retaliation was convened in the Alpine city of Trent. The Council of Trent, opening in 1545 under Pope Paul III and running in sessions until 1563, was the most important response to the Protestant Reformation. It did not apologize. It did not concede. Instead, it clarified, codified, and, in many ways, fortified the Church's positions. Yes, abuses were acknowledged. Yes, reforms were discussed. Bishops were ordered to reside in their dioceses, and seminaries were created to improve priestly education. But Trent's deeper message was defiance. The sale of indulgences was curbed, not condemned. Papal supremacy was upheld. The sacraments reaffirmed. The idea that salvation could come through faith alone, Luther's core doctrine, was anathematized. The walls were being rebuilt, and behind those walls stood a new breed of Catholic warrior, not with sword, but with intellect, discipline, and unwavering loyalty to the Pope. In 1540, Ignatius of Loyola, a former Spanish soldier turned mystic, received papal approval for a new order, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Trained in obedience, rhetoric, and reason, the Jesuits became the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation. They fanned out across the globe, into the courts of Europe, the jungles of Brazil, the streets of India, and the halls of imperial China, bringing with them both education and evangelism. They founded schools and universities, argued with Protestant theologians, and advised kings. To question papal authority was to face them across the lecture halls and pulpits of Christendom. But Rome's retaliation did not stop with persuasion. In 1542, Pope Paul III re-established the Roman Inquisition, a secretive tribunal empowered to root out heresy. Its agents worked in silence, summoning the accused to confess, recant, or suffer punishment, often imprisonment, occasionally death. Books were banned. Ideas were censored. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, first published in 1559 under Pope Paul IV, listed titles too dangerous for Catholic eyes. Even science would eventually come under its gaze. In 1633, a frail Galileo Galilei stood before the Inquisition in Rome, accused of heresy for teaching that the earth moved around the sun. Though a devout Catholic, his ideas defied the Aristotelian worldview upheld by church tradition. He was forced to recant. As legend has it, he whispered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. Whether he said it or not, the truth of the stars could not be silenced forever. Still, the grip of the church in this age was iron. In France, Catholic troops under the banners of Church and Crown clashed with Protestants in the French Wars of Religion from 1562 to 1598. In Spain, the Inquisition tormented Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity under duress, accusing them of secret heresy. In Italy, reformers vanished into dungeons or burned in public squares. And in southern France, a far darker episode unfolded with chilling finality. The Albigensian Crusade, begun in 1209, had already exposed the papacy's willingness to meet heresy with blood, but the ethos lingered. The memory of this campaign, where entire towns were slaughtered on the orders of papal legates, echoed through the Counter-Reformation. In the name of unity, dissent was erased. The paradox was stark. The Church of Love now acted through fear. The shepherd had raised a sword. Even the arts reflected this new authority. While the Renaissance popes had glorified the beauty of the human form, the Baroque Church sought to overwhelm the senses, to remind the faithful of heaven's majesty and hell's fire. In Rome, Gian Lorenzo Bernini sculpted the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, a vision of divine rapture carved in marble, hovering in sacred space. Gold, shadow, and divine agony fused in altars and chapels across Catholic Europe. It was not subtle, it was not soft, but it was magnificent. In this same period, new saints emerged, counterpoints to the corruption of earlier centuries. Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, Saint Francis de Sales, mystics and pastors who reminded the world that holiness still lived in the Church's heart. Their lives offered what the papacy alone could no longer fully provide, a glimpse of the divine untouched by ambition. By the close of the 17th century, the Catholic Church had reasserted itself. Protestantism was no longer a storm, it was a rival kingdom. Northern Europe had splintered into Lutheran and Calvinist states. England had broken away entirely under Henry VIII in the 1530s, creating an Anglican church with a monarch at its head. Wars of religion continued to rage, especially the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, which devastated Central Europe in battles that blurred lines between politics and theology. The papacy, once the uncontested center of Christian life, was now one voice among many. And yet, it survived. More than survived, it endured, with marble walls thicker than ever and a doctrine sharpened by fire. But the cost was high. The gentle whisper of grace had too often become a command shouted from a throne. The Counter-Reformation had preserved the papacy, but it had calcified its image. From soft light came hard borders, from mystery, machinery. The shepherd's crook had become a scepter, held tightly, wielded carefully, and defended at all costs. But the world was changing faster than dogma could chase it. Beneath the incense and gilded ceilings, whispers stirred once more. The Enlightenment was rising, and the throne of Peter would soon be challenged not by heretics, but by reason itself. The fall of papal power, revolution, nationalism, and the Vatican in chains. It began quietly, with ideas whispered in cafes and scrawled in the margins of treatises. But by the middle of the 18th century, those whispers had grown into a storm, a wind not of heresy this time, but of reason, of liberty, of rebellion. The Enlightenment had arrived, and with it came an entirely new kind of threat to the papacy, not religious, but ideological. The centuries-old image of the Pope as God's chosen sovereign on earth began to flicker in the harsh light of rational thought. Philosophers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau challenged not only monarchs but also the clergy, accusing them of superstition, oppression, and the manipulation of fear. The printing press, once the vessel of indulgence and anathema, now carried satire and scorn. Rome, once the moral center of Christendom, was increasingly seen in Enlightenment circles as a relic, an anachronism cloaked in gold. Then came the guillotine. In 1789, the French Revolution exploded, and with it the ancient alliance between throne and altar was shattered. By 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy had been passed, placing the French Church under state control. Bishops were required to swear allegiance not to the Pope in Rome, but to the secular republic. Many refused. Those who obeyed were excommunicated. France had declared war not only on monarchy, but on the very idea of papal authority. Pope Pius VI, who had condemned the revolution from afar, would soon feel its wrath. In 1798, French revolutionary forces marched into Rome. The Pope, now an elderly and frail man, was arrested and forced to travel north in chains. He would die a prisoner in the French city of Valence in 1799, a symbolic moment, as the Vicar of Christ was reduced to a political detainee. But it was only the beginning. In the chaos that followed, a new power emerged: Napoleon Bonaparte. Though he restored some religious freedoms in France with the Concordat of 1801, he treated the papacy as a tool to be wielded, not a power to be revered. Pope Pius VII, elected after the death of Pius VI, cautiously cooperated at first. He even traveled to Paris to preside over Napoleon's imperial coronation in 1804, only to watch as the general-turned emperor placed the crown upon his own head, brushing aside papal hands. By 1809, relations had soured. Napoleon annexed the Papal States and had Pius VII arrested and taken to Savona, then to Fontainebleau in France. Once again, the Pope was a prisoner. Once again, the throne of Peter had become a cage. When Napoleon fell in 1814, Pius VII returned to Rome, an old man now greeted with cheers, not just by the faithful, but by those who longed for order after the revolution's storms. Yet his restoration marked not a return to power, but a long twilight. The Papal States were reinstated, but the world had changed. Nationalism was rising, secular governments were gaining strength, and the papacy's days as a territorial power were numbered. The 19th century became a seesaw of confrontation and retreat. In 1848, revolution swept across Europe again. In Rome, the people rose against the papal government, declaring a republic. Pope Pius IX, who had initially shown liberal sympathies, fled the city. But in 1849, French troops invaded and restored him to power. This moment hardened him. Never again would he flirt with modern ideas. Instead, Pius IX withdrew behind walls, spiritually and politically. In 1864, he issued the Syllabus of Errors, a sweeping condemnation of modernity. Freedom of the press, democracy, secular education, even the separation of church and state. To many, it read like a manifesto of resistance against the modern world. And yet, the world would not stop turning. In 1860, during the unification of Italy, most of the Papal States were seized by nationalist forces under Giuseppe Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel II. Rome remained under papal control, protected by French troops, but not for long. When France withdrew its forces during the Franco-Prussian War, Italian forces moved in. On September 20, 1870, they breached the walls of Rome at the Porta Pia. The papacy had lost its temporal power. Rome was annexed into the Kingdom of Italy. The Pope, furious and humiliated, locked himself in the Apostolic Palace, refusing to recognize the new regime. Thus began what would be known as the prisoner in the Vatican era. Yet even in defeat, the papacy sought to reclaim a different kind of authority. In 1870, the very year Rome fell, Pius IX convened the First Vatican Council. It was here, against the backdrop of guns and nationalist banners, that one of the most controversial doctrines in papal history was declared: papal infallibility. According to the Council's dogma, when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, that is, officially and solemnly on matters of faith or morals, his pronouncements are protected from error by divine guidance. It was a bold spiritual counterstrike, a way of reinforcing papal supremacy at a moment when its worldly foundations had crumbled. This doctrine did not grant the Pope unlimited personal infallibility, as many misunderstood. It was carefully defined and narrowly scoped. but its symbolic power was immense. Rome had been taken, but the voice of the Pope, the Church declared, could still command from heaven. Pius IX died in 1878 after the longest papal reign in history up to that point, more than 31 years. He had witnessed the collapse of papal territory, endured exile, and presided over one of the most divisive councils in church history. Yet in death, his legacy remained fiercely defended by ultramontanists, those who believed in centralized papal power. His successor, Pope Leo XIII, would open a new chapter, one marked not by political dominion, but by careful diplomacy and moral suasion. But the old world, the world where popes crowned emperors and ruled cities from marble thrones, was over. Now the papacy stood at a strange crossroads, disrobed of its land, its armies gone, its palace surrounded by a hostile state. And yet, in retreat, it had discovered something strange and enduring, a purified kind of power, one that did not rely on territory or force, but on memory, doctrine, and myth. From the ashes of temporal rule, a different throne was being carved. No longer a king among kings, but a spiritual symbol above the noise of nations. And in that silence, the Church prepared once more to speak. Bookmark 46T1 Key, A Prisoner in White, Modern Papacy and the Struggle for Moral Relevance. In the fading candlelight of the 19th century, the Pope no longer walked as a prince of Europe. Instead, he paced behind locked gates, a figure in white surrounded by a swelling, secular world. After the capture of Rome in 1870, Pope Pius X declared himself the prisoner of the Vatican. For nearly 60 years, successive popes refused to leave the walls of the Apostolic Palace, declining to recognize the Kingdom of Italy or the legitimacy of the new Italian state. It was both protest and self-imposed exile, an attempt to hold on to dignity as history marched forward without them. And so the 20th century began not with triumph, but with silence. It was not until 1929, after long negotiations with Italy's fascist regime, that the standoff came to an end. In a curious alliance between spiritual authority and authoritarian power, Pope Pius V signed the Lateran Treaty with Benito Mussolini, establishing the Vatican City-State as an independent micronation, just 0.49 square kilometers, making it the smallest country in the world. In exchange, the Pope formally recognized the Italian state, and Italy acknowledged the sovereignty of the Holy See. A throne had been reborn, not through conquest or inheritance, but through concordat and compromise. Still, it was a throne now surrounded by the modern world, a world of telegraphs and tanks, of ideologies and total wars. It would not be long before the papacy would be tested again. When World War II erupted in 1939, the Vatican found itself in an impossible position, officially neutral, but morally entangled. The man elected just 5 months before the war's outbreak, Pope Pius VII, would become one of the most debated pontiffs of the modern age. He had served as the Vatican's ambassador to Germany and as Secretary of State under Pius XI, cultivating a deep knowledge of diplomacy and an abiding caution. When the Holocaust began, his voice was not silent, but neither was it thunderous. Critics accused him of moral cowardice, of failing to speak out forcefully against Nazi atrocities. Others defended him, noting his role in covert efforts to shelter Jews through church networks, monasteries, and diplomatic interventions. In 1942, he gave a radio address referring to hundreds of thousands being persecuted for no fault of their own. A veiled reference, but no explicit condemnation. By the time the war ended in 1945, over 6 million Jews had perished, and the Vatican's role remained cloaked in ambivalence and unanswered questions. When Pius XII died in 1958, the conclave that followed brought a moment no one expected: the election of a humble, elderly patriarch from Venice named Angelo Roncalli. He took the name John III, and with it, he opened windows long shut. In 1962, he convened the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, a spiritual revolution in the heart of Catholicism. Unlike previous councils summoned to combat heresy or reinforce authority, Vatican II sought renewal. Bishops and observers from around the world gathered in St. Peter's Basilica, not to condemn, but to listen. Over the next 3 years, the council produced sweeping changes. The Mass was now to be celebrated in vernacular languages instead of Latin. Lay people were encouraged to take active roles in worship, interfaith dialogue was promoted, and the Church declared its respect for religious freedom and the dignity of conscience. It was a breath of fresh air, a church rediscovering its pastoral heart, its capacity for humility. John III died in 1963, before the council concluded. His successor, Pope Paul VI, carried it forward to completion in 1965. But the years that followed were uncertain. The modern world was changing fast. Protests, revolutions, sexual liberation, the rise of mass media. The Church struggled to adapt. Many of its faithful felt disoriented. Some left. Others clung to the past with white-knuckled hands. The papacy, once a pillar of permanence, now faced a different challenge: how to be morally relevant without wielding temporal power. Then came the man who would restore not authority, but visibility. In 1978, after the sudden death of Pope John Paul V, himself only 33 days into the papacy, a young Polish cardinal was elected. He was the first non-Italian pope in over 450 years. His name was Karol Wojtyła, and the world would come to know him as Pope John Paul II. He was a man of astonishing presence, athletic, intellectual, deeply theatrical. Fluent in multiple languages, he became a globe-trotting pontiff, visiting over 120 countries during his papacy. His charisma breathed new life into the office, drawing millions to stadiums, parks, and plazas to see the Pope not as a remote figure in marble, but as a living shepherd. He survived an assassination attempt in 1981, famously forgiving his would-be killer in prison. He played a crucial role in supporting the Solidarity movement in his native Poland, inspiring resistance to communist regimes across Eastern Europe. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, many credited his moral leadership as part of the collapse. And yet, beneath the charisma, the papacy remained cautious. John Paul II reaffirmed traditional stances on birth control, female ordination, and sexuality. He saw himself as a guardian of truth in a world of shifting sands. He died in 2005 after 26 years on the throne of Peter. The conclave that followed elected his longtime doctrinal enforcer, Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI. A brilliant theologian and deeply conservative, Benedict lacked the public warmth of his predecessor. He emphasized orthodoxy, tradition, and liturgical reverence. But his papacy was also marked by shadows. The global sexual abuse crisis, which had emerged in the early 2000s, deepened under his watch. Reports of decades-long cover-ups, secret settlements, and systemic failures erupted from dioceses across the world. The Vatican, long silent, now found itself answering to courts, journalists, and survivors. Trust eroded. Credibility crumbled. In a stunning act, Benedict did what no pope had done in nearly 600 years. He resigned the papacy in 2013, citing age and frailty. It was a moment that felt both unprecedented and deeply human. And in his place, the cardinals turned to a new face, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. He took the name Francis, the first pope ever to do so, evoking the saint of poverty, humility, and peace. He stepped onto the balcony and said simply, "Buonasera," good evening. Pope Francis has sought to recenter the papacy on compassion. He speaks of climate change, the poor, refugees, and the dignity of the marginalized. He has washed the feet of prisoners, embraced the disfigured, and urged the Church to be a field hospital in a broken world. And yet his efforts to reform the Vatican bureaucracy, the Curia, have faced resistance. Financial scandals continue to plague the Vatican Bank. The sexual abuse crisis, though now more openly acknowledged, still festers in many places, with justice slow and incomplete. Francis walks a tightrope between tradition and progress, between reform and restraint. He is a pope beloved by many, criticized by others, and often misunderstood by both. But through it all, he continues the long journey begun when the papacy laid down its sword and picked up its staff. Once the pope was a monarch among kings. Now he is something else, part pastor, part prophet, part symbol in a fractured age. And behind him always looms the paradox, the white robes of sanctity and the long, heavy shadow of history. Scandals, secrets, and survival. The papacy in the age of transparency. The world had changed, the digital dawn had broken, and with it came a new kind of light, one that pierced shadows, exposed secrets, and demanded answers. In this new age, the Vatican, once a master of silence and mystery, found itself increasingly unable to conceal the cracks in its marble walls. The late 20th century saw the papacy step further onto the world stage than ever before. John Paul II, already a towering spiritual figure, became a symbol of moral resistance in a fractured world. In 1995, he gathered millions in the Philippines for what remains one of the largest papal gatherings in history. In 2000, he marked the turn of the millennium with a public apology for the sins of the Church, crusades, inquisitions, anti-Semitism, and abuse of power. It was a moment of contrition rare in papal history. But for many, it wasn't enough. The new century brought a reckoning. In 2002, explosive reports from Boston revealed a vast pattern of child sexual abuse by Catholic priests, covered up for decades by church authorities. What had long been whispered in hushed tones now screamed from headlines. Dozens of dioceses across the United States, and soon across Europe, Latin America, Australia, and beyond, were found to have sheltered abusers, shuffled predators from parish to parish, and silenced survivors. The sheer scale was staggering, and it was global. In Ireland, government inquiries uncovered decades of abuse and neglect in church-run institutions. In Germany, a report released in 2018 detailed more than 3,600 cases of abuse since 1946. In Chile, bishops resigned en masse after a papal investigation into widespread cover-ups. No longer could the Vatican rely on denials or evasion. Pope Benedict XVI, once head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, had been responsible for handling abuse cases before becoming pope in 2005. Under his papacy, some limited reforms were introduced. Priests were defrocked, procedures were streamlined, but the institutional inertia remained heavy, and transparency elusive. By 2010, scandal had begun to undermine the Vatican's moral credibility in the public eye. That same year, Pope Benedict declared abuse a terrible crime, yet critics noted the Church's response remained reactive, legalistic, and slow. And so, in February 2013, the unthinkable happened. Benedict XVI resigned. His announcement stunned the world. He cited his declining strength and the weight of his responsibilities. But behind the scenes, there was more. A maelstrom of crises. The abuse scandals, internal power struggles, and growing reports of financial corruption within the Vatican Bank, formerly known as the Institute for the Works of Religion. For the first time since Pope Gregory XII in 1415, the See of Peter was voluntarily vacated. The conclave that followed elected a surprise candidate, the Argentine Jesuit Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He was the first pope from the Americas, the first Jesuit pope, and the first to take the name Francis, after the beloved saint of humility and peace. His election in March 2013 marked a shift in tone and style. He rejected the papal palace, choosing instead to live in a modest guest house. He wore simple white robes, shunning the ornate red shoes and golden vestments. He spoke of mercy, poverty, and reform. And he quickly became a global figure of hope. Francis opened commissions to investigate abuse, created a special tribunal for bishops accused of negligence, and met with survivors. He declared a zero-tolerance policy. In 2018, he removed powerful cardinals implicated in abuse cover-ups, including Theodore McCarrick, who became the first cardinal to be laicized for sexual misconduct. Yet progress was uneven. Survivors still struggled to obtain justice. Many accused bishops remained untouched. Bureaucratic resistance within the Curia persisted, and the Pope's own responses, at times firm, at times vague, left some questioning his resolve. Meanwhile, the financial scandals deepened. In 2012, leaked documents, known as Vedi leaks, revealed infighting, mismanagement, and questionable transactions inside the Vatican Bank. A second wave of leaks in 2015, just 2 years into Francis's papacy, further exposed corruption and resistance to change. In response, Francis launched an ambitious campaign to clean house. He created new oversight bodies, introduced laws to prevent money laundering, and demanded transparency. But entrenched interests, long protected by secrecy, pushed back. In 2020, the Vatican faced another embarrassment, the London property scandal, in which church funds were funneled into a luxury real estate deal riddled with fraud. Francis pressed forward, but the deeper truth remained. The Vatican was no longer an empire in command of the world. It was an institution under scrutiny, struggling to live its ideals while managing its history. And then came another blow to tradition. In 2013, with Benedict still alive in retirement, the Church had two living popes, one active, one contemplative. When Benedict XVI died in December 2022, he was buried not as a reigning pontiff, but as a former pope. A symbol of continuity and rupture, all at once. As Francis aged, dealing with recurring health issues and whispers of possible resignation, questions about the future of the papacy grew louder. Would it remain a singular office, or could multiple retired popes become the norm? Could the Vatican ever fully cleanse its past? And yet Francis pressed on. He released encyclicals on climate change, Laudato Si in 2015, and on human fraternity. He called capitalism without ethics the dung of the devil, and warned of the spiritual dangers of populism. He apologized to Indigenous peoples in Canada for the Church's role in residential schools. He worked to elevate women to senior Vatican roles and opened discussions on married priests in remote regions. But there were limits. His calls for reform on issues like LGBTQ inclusion, the role of women, and clerical celibacy met fierce resistance. Conservative critics accused him of diluting doctrine. Progressives urged him to move faster. The Church stood at a crossroads, still vast, still powerful, yet fragmented and uncertain. Meanwhile, behind the guarded doors of the Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly known as the Secret Archives, millions of documents sat quietly. Some have been opened, including the controversial records of Pius XII's wartime papacy, now under review. But others remain sealed, waiting. What secrets still sleep beneath the marble? What decisions, what betrayals, what truths are too heavy to bear? The halls of the Vatican have held the weight of centuries. Some shadows are slow to lift, and yet the white-robed figure still walks the loggia. He speaks to a world now instant, impatient, and watching. His staff is lighter, his throne more symbolic than sovereign, but he still holds something vast. A story, a witness, a mystery not yet ended. 2,000 years have passed since Peter died in the dust of Nero's circus, and still the fisherman's ring is worn. The centuries lie behind us now, like waves trailing in the wake of a ship, disappearing into the night. 2,000 years. A line of men robed in white, bearing a crown woven from gold and silence, walking a path between heaven and earth, between power and humility, faith and politics, glory and ruin. From a fisherman crucified upside down in Nero's Rome, to a pontiff addressing the world from a balcony lit by smartphones, the papacy has never been a simple thing. It has been a mirror of the world it inhabits, reflecting its hopes, its fears, its hunger for meaning, and its thirst for control. We have walked through the catacombs, where believers whispered in fear, and through palaces where popes dined with kings and plotted with assassins. We have seen parchments forged in candlelight to steal empires, and holy wars sanctioned from golden thrones. We have heard the cries of the faithful and the silences of betrayal. We have stood beneath the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, painted in splendor while salvation was sold outside its doors. And always the white robe, so pure in appearance, so heavy in meaning. Every age placed its own stains upon it, some faded by time, others still visible in full light. The martyrs bled into it, the monarchs embroidered it, the reformers tore at it, and the victims, the silenced, the wounded, the forgotten, they mark it still. It is a garment of contradictions, a symbol of divine service, and a vestment of political authority. The Pope is called the servant of the servants of God, yet has lived as prince, as ruler, as judge, and general. He is said to hold the keys of heaven, yet walks through corridors built with secrets and shadows. The office has inspired saints. It has harbored monsters. And most often, it has been occupied by men simply trying to survive a role larger than themselves. But perhaps that is the truth of the papacy. It is not the perfection of one man, but the unbroken thread of something stranger. Something that has endured through blood and fire, through schisms and scandals, through collapses of empires and the rise of republics. It has bent but not broken. It has shrunk but not disappeared. It has been mocked, feared, adored, and ignored. And yet it stands, not because it is pure, but because it is persistent. And so we end where we began, in silence, in awe, in the presence of a crown not made of gold alone, but of light and shadow, of whispers and proclamations, of frailty and conviction. Close your eyes now, traveler. Let the centuries settle like dust. The stories remain, echoing through marble halls and faded manuscripts. The voices of emperors and heretics, of visionaries and victims, all still whisper beneath the stones. Sleep now, the white robe still moves, and the centuries will keep.